Millionaire in disguise pretends to be poor in a small country town to find true love. The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of Elliot Reed's penthouse, sending fragments skittering across the room like fallen stars. He stood frozen at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the Seattle skyline, watching the woman he'd thought he loved storm toward his private elevator. "Miranda, wait." His voice cracked, betraying the composure that had made him a legend in boardrooms across 3 continents. She whirled around, her designer dress catching the light from the city below. "Wait for what, Elliot? For you to write me another check? For you to buy me another meaningless gift?" Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "God, I actually thought you were different." The elevator doors slid open with a whisper, and Miranda stepped inside without looking back. But her parting words echoed in the sudden silence. "You'll never find anyone who loves you for who you really are. Because deep down, you don't even know who that is anymore." The penthouse fell silent except for the hum of city life 40 stories below. Elliot pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging the window. At 34, he commanded a tech empire worth billions, employed thousands, and had his face on magazine covers. Yet standing in his $15 million apartment, surrounded by everything money could buy, he'd never felt more alone. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop, probably his assistant with updates on the quarterly reports, or his publicist with interview requests, or his accountant with investment opportunities. Always someone who wanted something from him. Never someone who simply wanted him. The breaking point had been building for months, maybe years. Every relationship began the same way: attraction, excitement, promises of genuine connection. But eventually, they all revealed their true motives. The aspiring actress who needed funding for her indie film. The socialite who wanted access to his exclusive circles. The CEO who saw marriage as a merger opportunity. Miranda had been different, or so he'd believed. She ran her own successful marketing firm, drove her own car, paid for her own dinners. For 6 months, he'd thought he'd finally found someone who saw him as more than a walking ATM. Until tonight, when he'd overheard her phone call to her sister. "The ring better be at least 5 carats, or I'm done wasting my time with this tech nerd." Elliot walked to his home office, past walls lined with awards and accolades that felt hollow now. He pulled up his laptop and began typing, his fingers moving with the decisive speed that had built his fortune. Flight reservations, hotel cancellations, meeting postponements. Within an hour, he'd cleared his calendar for the next 3 months, something his board would consider insanity, something his competitors would call weakness. But Elliot Reed, the man who'd revolutionized cloud computing and turned a dorm room startup into a global powerhouse, was about to disappear. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, the only thing he'd kept from his childhood in rural Oregon. Inside, yellowed pages held the dreams of a boy who'd wanted nothing more than to matter to someone, to be loved not for what he could provide, but for who he was beneath it all. His fingers traced the faded ink of his teenage handwriting. "Someday I'll find someone who sees me, really sees me, when I have nothing to prove." That night, Elliot Reed began planning his own disappearance. Not suicide, not running from the law, but something far more dangerous. He was going to find out if the man beneath the billions was worth loving at all. The city lights blurred through his tears as he made a decision that would either destroy him or save him. By morning, Elliot Reed would cease to exist. In his place would be someone new, someone poor, someone real. Someone who might finally discover what it meant to be loved. 3 weeks later, a rusted pickup truck wheezed into Millbrook, population 2,847, trailing black smoke and making sounds that suggested its next stop might be the scrapyard. Behind the wheel sat a man who looked nothing like the polished tech mogul who'd graced the cover of Forbes just months earlier. Gone were the $1,000 suits and Italian leather shoes. In their place, Elliot, now calling himself Eli, wore faded jeans with genuine wear marks, work boots that had seen actual work, and a flannel shirt that had cost him $12 at a thrift store in Portland. His usually perfectly styled hair was longer now, tucked under a baseball cap, and a carefully cultivated scruff covered his jawline. The transformation had taken weeks of preparation. He'd studied YouTube videos on how to change his appearance, practiced altering his speech patterns to lose the crisp diction of private schools and Ivy League universities, and learned to walk differently. less purposeful stride, more working man shuffle. He'd opened a bank account under a carefully constructed alias, funded with just enough money to seem like a drifter's life savings. Most importantly, he'd made himself forget how to be Elliot Reed. The confident handshake, the penetrating eye contact, the unconscious expectation that others would bend to his will, all of it had to go. In its place, he cultivated uncertainty, humility, and the kind of awkward earnestness that money couldn't buy. The truck sputtered to a stop in front of a weathered building with a hand-painted sign. June's Sunrise Diner, best coffee this side of heaven. Through the large front windows, he could see mismatched tables and chairs, walls covered in local memorabilia, and a counter that had seen decades of coffee cups and conversation. A bell chimed as he pushed open the door, and the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee hit him like a warm embrace. The diner was busier than he'd expected for 2 in the afternoon. Farmers in work clothes, elderly couples sharing pie, a table of teenagers who should probably be in school. "Sit anywhere you like, honey. I'll be right with you." The voice came from behind the counter, where a woman stood with her back to him, dark hair pulled into a messy bun secured with what looked like a pencil. She wore jeans and a white t-shirt under a flour-dusted apron, and when she turned around, Elliot forgot how to breathe. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the way of the models and actresses he'd dated. Her face was heart-shaped with a spattering of freckles across her nose. Her smile was slightly crooked, and there was a smudge of what looked like chocolate on her cheek. But her eyes, warm brown with flecks of gold, held an intelligence and humor that made his chest tighten. "You passing through or looking to stay a while?" she asked, approaching his table with a coffee pot and a practiced ease that spoke of years behind a counter. "Staying, I hope," he managed, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "I'm looking for work, and maybe a place to rent." She poured his coffee without asking if he wanted it, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Work's hard to come by around here, especially if you're not from farming stock." "What kind of work you looking for?" "Anything, really. I'm good with my hands, or at least I think I am. Fixing things, building things." The lie came easier than he'd expected, though the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built a business empire but couldn't change his own oil. "June Carter," she said, extending a hand calloused from years of honest work. "I own this place, and before you ask, yes, like the country singer, and no, I can't carry a tune to save my life." "Eli," he replied, taking her hand and trying not to notice how right it felt in his. "Eli Walsh." "Well, Eli Walsh, you picked an interesting time to roll into Millbrook. We just lost our handyman to retirement, and Lord knows this old building needs more fixing than I can afford to pay for." She studied his face with an intensity that made him wonder if she could see through his carefully constructed facade. "You have references?" His stomach dropped. In all his planning, he'd somehow overlooked the basic requirement of employment, references from previous jobs he'd never actually had. Not exactly. I've been doing odd jobs, cash work mostly, moving around a lot." Something shifted in her expression, not suspicion exactly, but wariness. "Running from something?" "No," he said quickly, then forced himself to slow down. "Just looking for something, I guess. A place to belong." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the small table, and Elliot felt exposed in a way that boardroom negotiations had never made him feel. June Carter was seeing him, not the billions in his bank account or the power he wielded, but the man sitting in her diner wearing thrift store clothes and asking for a chance. "There's a room above the auto shop down the street," she said finally. "Pete Kowalski owns it. Lost his wife last year and could use the company. Rent's cheap if you don't mind the smell of motor oil and the sound of air wrenches." "That sounds perfect." As for work, she hesitated, weighing something in her mind. "The back porch is about to fall off this building, and the freezer makes a sound like a dying walrus. I can't pay much, but I can feed you and maybe throw in enough cash to keep you in gas money. Interested?" Elliot looked around the diner, at the cracked linoleum, the mismatched furniture, the obvious signs of a business struggling to stay afloat. In his previous life, he would have seen opportunity, calculated profit margins, considered acquisition possibilities. Now, all he saw was a woman trying to keep her dream alive with determination and coffee-stained hope. "When do I start?" June's smile transformed her entire face, and for the first time in years, Elliot felt like he might be exactly where he belonged. What he didn't know was that June Carter had her own secrets, her own reasons for being cautious with strangers, and her own heart that had been broken too many times to trust easily. As she walked away to serve other customers, she found herself glancing back at the man who called himself Eli Walsh, wondering why something about him felt both completely foreign and strangely familiar. Neither of them realized that their lives had just become irrevocably intertwined, or that the simple act of offering work to a stranger would set in motion a chain of events that would test everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and the courage it takes to be vulnerable. The afternoon sun slanted through the diner windows, illuminating dust motes that danced between them like tiny harbingers of change. 2 months into his new life, Elliot had never been so exhausted, so frustrated, or so strangely content. His hands, once smooth from a lifetime of keyboard work and handshake deals, were now scarred with cuts and calluses. His back ached from hunching over broken pipes and stubborn fixtures, and his pride bore the daily wounds of June's increasingly creative commentary on his complete lack of practical skills. Eli, honey, when I said fix the porch step, I didn't mean create a modern art installation. June called from the diner's back door, trying to hide her laughter behind a dish rag. He sat back on his heels, surveying the disaster of wood planks, bent nails, and what appeared to be a small crater where the step used to be. His hammer lay abandoned beside him like a weapon of mass destruction, and his flannel shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool October morning. I can get it, he muttered, more to himself than to her. I just need to approach it differently. Approach it differently? June stepped carefully around the wreckage to stand beside him. Eli, you've been approaching this step like it personally offended your mother. It's just wood and nails. She knelt beside him, her proximity making his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with manual labor. Her hair had escaped its usual bun, framing her face in soft waves, and the morning light caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Here, she said, taking the hammer from his hands. It's not about force. It's about finesse. Her hands covered his as she guided the hammer, and Elliot fought to concentrate on the task rather than the way her touch sent electricity up his arms. She positioned the nail with practiced ease, then brought the hammer down in one smooth motion. The nail sank into the wood with a satisfying thunk. See? Gentle but firm. Like most things worth doing right. The innocent comment made heat rise in his cheeks, and he turned away before she could see his reaction. You make it look easy. 28 years of living in buildings held together by prayer and stubbornness, she said with a shrug. You learn to fix things, or you learn to live without them. We never had the luxury of calling a handyman. It was the first time she'd mentioned her childhood, and Elliot found himself hungry for more details about the woman who seemed to hold the diner, her teenage brother, and half the town together through sheer force of will. What about your parents? He asked carefully, focusing on positioning another nail. June's hands stilled for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made his chest tighten. Mom died when I was 19. Cancer. Dad. Well, Dad checked out long before that. Some people aren't built for the long haul, you know? She stood abruptly, brushing sawdust off her jeans. I should get back inside. The breakfast rush won't serve itself. But she paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Eli, thanks for trying so hard. Most people would have given up by now. After she disappeared inside, Elliot sat in the October sunshine, turning her words over in his mind. Most people would have given up by now. If she only knew that giving up was exactly what had brought him here. Giving up on finding real love. Giving up on believing anyone could see past his money. Giving up on the idea that Elliot Reed deserved happiness. The bell above the diner door chimed, and he looked up to see a teenage boy with June's dark hair and stubborn chin. This had to be Danny, the brother she'd mentioned, but whom Elliot had never actually met. You the guy who's been terrorizing our back porch? Danny asked, eyeing the construction zone with barely concealed amusement. Guilty, Elliot admitted. You must be Danny. And you must be the world's worst handyman. Danny grinned, and the resemblance to his sister was striking. June says you're trying, though, which counts for something in her book. What counts in your book? Danny's expression grew serious, the teenager momentarily replaced by someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Actions. June's been taking care of me since I was 10, working herself half to death to keep this place running and make sure I stay in school. She doesn't trust easy, but when she does, he shrugged. Just don't be another person who disappoints her, okay? The weight of responsibility settled on Elliot's shoulders like a lead blanket. I won't. Good. Danny's grin returned. Now, want me to show you how to actually fix that step? I've been helping June patch this place together since I was tall enough to hold a screwdriver. For the next hour, Danny patiently taught Elliot the basics of carpentry while sharing stories about growing up in Millbrook. The boy was whip-smart, planning to study engineering at the state university if he could get enough scholarship money. He spoke about June with a mixture of gratitude and protective fierce love that made Elliot understand why she'd sacrificed so much for him. She had a scholarship too, you know, Danny said as they fitted the last board into place. Full ride to culinary school in Portland. Gave it up when Mom died and Dad took off. Never once made me feel like it was my fault. But he hammered a nail with more force than necessary. Sometimes I wonder who she might have been if she hadn't had to be my mom and dad and sister all rolled into one. Elliot's chest tightened as pieces of June's story began forming a picture. The woman who served coffee with a smile every morning, who knew every customer's order by heart, who somehow kept an aging diner profitable in a town that was slowly dying. She'd given up her dreams to raise her brother and had never looked back. That afternoon, as the lunch rush wound down, Elliot found June in the diner's tiny office, surrounded by stacks of bills and invoices. Her shoulders were tense, and there were lines of worry around her eyes that he'd never noticed before. Everything okay? She looked up, startled, then quickly shuffled some papers together. Fine, just paying bills. The glamorous side of restaurant ownership. But he'd caught a glimpse of the letterhead on one of the documents, a notice from the bank about mortgage arrears. His business instincts, honed by years of reading financial statements, immediately recognized the signs of a business in trouble. June, if you need. I don't need anything, she said quickly, too quickly. We're fine. We're always fine. The words hung between them, and Elliot saw through them to the pride and fear beneath. June Carter would work herself into the ground before she'd admit she needed help, and something about that fierce independence made him want to protect her even more. That evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch steps sharing a beer and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, June leaned against his shoulder with a sigh. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? I nearly demolished your back porch. For staying. For not giving up when I made fun of your hammering technique. She tilted her head to look at him. For being different. Different how? Most men who come through here are either looking for something they can take or running from something they've lost. You seem like you're looking for something you want to build. If only she knew, Elliot thought, that what he wanted to build was a life with her. A real life, built on truth and genuine connection rather than bank statements and business deals. But as her head settled more comfortably against his shoulder and her breathing grew steady in the evening quiet, he realized he was living on borrowed time. The longer he stayed, the deeper his feelings grew, and the harder it would be to explain why he'd lied about everything. Yet for now, in this moment, with June Carter trusting him enough to let her guard down and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Elliot let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to keep both his secret and the woman who was slowly stealing his heart. He just didn't realize that secrets, like badly driven nails, have a way of working themselves loose when you least expect it. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in December, wrapped in the innocent form of a rental car, with Seattle plates pulling up outside June's Sunrise Diner. Elliot was under the kitchen sink, wrestling with a pipe that had apparently been installed during the Coolidge administration, when he heard the bell chime and unfamiliar footsteps cross the worn linoleum. Excuse me, I'm looking for someone who might have passed through here recently, a woman's voice said, crisp with professional authority. Tall, dark hair, probably going by a different name. He would have arrived sometime in late summer. Elliot's blood turned to ice water. His hands, slick with pipe grease and sudden sweat, slipped on the wrench, and he barely managed to stifle a curse as his knuckles scraped against the cabinet frame. Honey, half the men who come through here fit that description, June replied with the easy friendliness she showed all customers. You want some coffee while you think about it? Best in 3 counties, or so I keep telling people. Actually, I'm a reporter with the Seattle Business Journal. I'm working on a story about missing executives. This particular man, Sarah fucking Morrison. The words escaped Elliot's lips in a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the diner, they might as well have been shouted. Sarah Morrison, the reporter who'd been dogging his company for months, trying to break the story of his disappearance. Somehow, she tracked him here. Above him, he could hear June's voice, more cautious now. I'm sorry, but I can't help you with whatever story you're chasing. This is a diner, not a detective agency. Of course, I understand. But if you do happen to remember anyone unusual who... The back door slammed, and Elliot heard Danny's voice, tight with teenage bravado. June? There's some woman out front asking questions about. He stopped short, clearly realizing the woman in question was standing right there. About what, Danny? June asked, and Elliot could picture the sharp look she was probably giving her brother. Nothing. Just some guy she's looking for. Elliot closed his eyes, knowing with horrible certainty that Danny had seen the rental car, maybe even glimpsed Sarah Morrison through the window, and in typical teenage fashion had come bursting in with information that would only make everything worse. I'll just leave my card, Sarah said, her reporter instincts clearly sensing an opportunity. In case anyone remembers anything. The man I'm looking for, he's quite wealthy. Someone who helps me find him could be looking at a substantial reward. The word reward hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Elliot could practically feel the wheels turning in every mind within earshot. In a town like Millbrook, where most people lived paycheck to paycheck, a substantial reward was the kind of windfall that could change lives. Keep your money, June said, her voice cooler now. We don't sell out neighbors here. But the damage was done. As Sarah Morrison's heels clicked across the floor and the bell chimed her exit, Elliot remained frozen under the sink, knowing that his carefully constructed life was beginning to crumble. It wasn't a matter of if his secret would come out anymore, but when. He spent the rest of the day in a state of controlled panic, jumping every time the diner bell chimed, waiting for June to confront him with questions he couldn't answer. But she seemed preoccupied, distracted, serving customers with less than her usual warmth and disappearing into the office frequently to make hushed phone calls. That evening, as he was preparing to leave, she finally cornered him by the back door. Eli, we need to talk. His heart hammered against his ribs. About what? About the fact that you've been lying to me from the day you walked in here. The words hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing there was nothing he could say that wouldn't make everything worse. I know you're not who you say you are, June continued, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. I've known for weeks. The way you talk sometimes, like you're used to people hanging on your every word. The way you hold yourself when you think no one's looking. The fact that for someone who's supposedly been doing manual labor for years, you started with hands softer than a baby's bottom. June, I can explain. Can you? Because I've been trying to figure out what kind of man creates an entire fake identity just to what? Slum it with the small-town folk. Have a good laugh about how easily you fooled the dumb diner owner. The pain in her voice cut deeper than any anger could have. It's not like that. It was never like that. Then what is it like, Eli? Or is that even your real name? He stood there, mouth dry, knowing that this moment would determine everything. He could tell her the truth and watch her realize she'd been dating a billionaire who'd lied to her for months. Or he could maintain the charade and watch her hate him for being a fraud. Before he could answer, the front door burst open and Danny rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like betrayal. June, you need to see this. He thrust his phone toward them, the screen showing a Google search result. I looked up that reporter woman after she left, and then I searched for missing executives from Seattle, and Elliot's LinkedIn photo stared back at them from the small screen. Older, more polished, but unmistakably him. The headline read, Tech mogul Elliot Reed missing for 3 months. Company stock plummets. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. June took the phone from her brother's hands, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, a kind of devastated understanding. Elliot Reed, she whispered, reading from the screen. CEO of Reed Technologies. Net worth estimated at $3.2 billion. She looked up at him, and the pain in her eyes nearly brought him to his knees. You're a billionaire. June, please let me explain. A billionaire, she repeated, as if the word were foreign. And you've been here for 3 months, letting me pay you minimum wage to fix my broken-down diner, letting me worry about making rent, letting me. Her voice broke. letting me fall in love with a man who doesn't even exist. I exist, he said desperately. Everything between us, everything we've shared, that's real. I'm real. Are you? Because the man I thought I knew was broke and humble and grateful for a chance to belong somewhere. But you're just a rich boy playing dress up, aren't you? Having your little adventure before you go back to your real life. That's not. Get out. The words came out quiet, deadly. Get out of my diner, get out of my town, and get out of my life. June, please. Get out. The last two words were screamed with such raw pain that several customers in the dining room turned to stare. Danny stepped protectively closer to his sister, his teenage face set in hard lines. You heard her, Danny said. Leave. Elliot looked between them. The woman whose heart he'd broken and the boy who'd trusted him enough to teach him carpentry, and realized there were no words that could fix what he'd destroyed. With his secret exposed and his lies laid bare, he was once again exactly what he'd always been, alone. He turned and walked toward the door, each step feeling like a small death. At the threshold, he paused and looked back, hoping against hope that June might give him some sign that forgiveness was possible. But she had turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and Danny's arm was around her as he whispered comfort against her hair. Elliot stepped into the cold December night and let the door swing shut behind him, knowing he'd just lost the only thing that had ever made him feel truly wealthy. What he didn't know was that June, despite her anger and heartbreak, would spend the rest of the night staring at his photo on Danny's phone, wondering if the man she'd fallen in love with had been real at all, or just another beautiful lie told by someone who had everything except the one thing that mattered most. The snow began falling 3 days after Elliot left Millbrook, blanketing the town in pristine white that made everything look clean and new. But inside June's Sunrise Diner, the atmosphere was anything but fresh. The breakfast rush had dwindled to a trickle of regulars who cast worried glances at their normally cheerful hostess as she moved through her morning routine like a sleepwalker. June hadn't slept more than a few hours since Tuesday night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elliot's face, not the polished LinkedIn photo, but the man who'd sat on her back porch sharing beer and stories, who'd laughed when she'd teased him about his hammering technique, who'd listened to her dreams as if they were the most important things in the world. Had any of it been real? You're going to burn the bacon if you keep staring at it like that, Danny said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. His backpack was slung over his shoulder, ready for school, but his eyes held the worried maturity that had aged him beyond his 17 years. I'm fine, June said automatically, flipping the strips with more force than necessary. You're not fine. You've been crying in the walk-in cooler when you think no one's looking, and you jumped 3 feet in the air yesterday when Mrs. Patterson asked for extra butter. June paused, her hands stilling on the spatula. Sometimes she forgot how observant her brother could be, especially when it came to her well-being. He'd been taking care of her as much as she'd been taking care of him, and the realization made her throat tight. I just feel so stupid, she whispered, finally giving voice to the shame that had been eating at her for 3 days. How could I not know? How could I be so blind? Danny reached across the counter and took her flour-dusted hand in his. Because you're not stupid, June. You're trusting. There's a difference. Is there? I fell for a complete lie. 3 months, Danny. 3 months of thinking I'd found someone who understood what it was like to struggle, who appreciated simple things because he'd never had much. She laughed bitterly. Meanwhile, he probably spends more on lunch than I make in a week. Maybe, Danny said carefully. Or maybe he was just lonely. June stared at her brother. Lonely? He's a billionaire, Danny. He can buy whatever he wants, including companionship. Can he, though? Danny pulled out his phone and showed her the screen, where he'd been researching Elliot Reed for the past 3 days. Look at this stuff, June. Every article about him mentions how he never gives personal interviews, how he's known for being intensely private. And look at these photos from charity events and business functions. June reluctantly looked at the images Danny scrolled through. In every single one, Elliot stood slightly apart from the crowd, his smile polished but empty, his eyes holding a distance that seemed to separate him from everyone around him. He looks miserable, she said quietly. Yeah, he does. And you know what else? There are tons of articles about women who dated him, but they all say the same thing, that he was generous but distant, that he seemed to be going through the motions. One of them said it was like dating a ghost. June wanted to dismiss Danny's amateur psychology, but something about the observation rang true. There had been moments during their time together when Eli, had seemed surprised by simple kindness, as if genuine warmth was foreign to him. That doesn't excuse the lying, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. No, it doesn't. But maybe it explains it. Before June could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and Pete Kowalski entered, stomping snow off his boots. Pete ran the auto shop and had been Elliot's landlord during his time in Millbrook. His weathered face was troubled as he approached the counter. "Morning, June." "Danny." He accepted a cup of coffee gratefully, wrapping his work-roughened hands around the mug. "I wanted to talk to you about your friend Eli." "He's not my friend," June said quickly. "And his name is Elliot Reed, in case you haven't heard." "I heard." Pete's voice was gruff with emotion. "That's why I'm here." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, worn from handling. "He left this for you the night he took off. Made me promise not to give it to you unless you asked about him first, or unless a week passed. Figured you had a right to be angry without him pestering you with letters." June stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. Her name was written on the front in Elliot's careful handwriting, the same handwriting she'd seen on work orders and grocery lists, rendered familiar through 3 months of shared daily life. "I don't want it," she said. "Your choice," Pete said, setting the envelope on the counter between them. "But I'll tell you this. In 40 years of renting that room, I never had a tenant who cared more about leaving it better than he found it. He spent his last 3 days here fixing everything he could find wrong with the place. New wiring, fresh paint, fixed the heating unit. Didn't have to do any of it." Pete finished his coffee and stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Also found this in the truck he left behind." He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and placed it beside the envelope. "Might interest you to know what kind of man you really fell for." After Pete left, June and Danny stared at the envelope and notebook as if they were unexploded bombs. "You going to read them?" Danny asked. "I don't know." June's hands trembled as she picked up the notebook, its leather cover soft with age. What if it makes everything worse? What if it makes everything clearer? She opened the notebook to a random page and found herself looking at teenage handwriting, the words of a 17-year-old boy who had nothing and dreamed of everything. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone will ever love me for who I really am, not what I might become." Today at school, Jake Morrison asked if he could copy my calculus homework, and when I said yes, he said I was good for something after all. I know he didn't mean it as an insult, but it felt like one. Like I'm only valuable for what I can give people. I want to matter to someone. Really matter. Not because I'm useful or convenient, but because they see something in me that's worth loving. June's eyes filled with tears as she flipped through more pages, watching Elliot's handwriting mature, but his fundamental longing remained unchanged. Page after page revealed the heart of a boy who grew into a man surrounded by people, but desperately alone. With shaking hands, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and something else, a deed. Her deed. The deed to the diner building that she'd been struggling to keep. The letter was shorter than she'd expected. "June, I know you hate me right now, and you have every right to. I lied to you about everything except the most important thing, how I felt about you. Every moment we shared, every laugh, every quiet evening on the porch, every time I fell a little more in love with you, that was real. That was the most real I've ever been in my life. I came to Millbrook because I was tired of being loved for my bank account instead of my heart. I wanted to know if anyone could love Elliot Reed the man, not Elliot Reed the billionaire. You did. You loved Eli Walsh, who was really just me without the money and the facade. You loved the man I'd forgotten I could be. I should have told you the truth weeks ago, but I was terrified of losing what we had. Ironic, isn't it? My fear of losing you is exactly what made me lose you. The deed to your building is yours now, free and clear. It's not charity, and it's not an apology. It's a thank you. You gave me a place to belong, a reason to get up every morning, and proof that I was worth loving. The least I can do is give you the security to keep your dreams alive. I'm going back to Seattle to face the mess I left behind. I don't know if I'll ever find my way back to being the man you knew, but I'll try. You made me better, June. You made me real. If you can ever forgive me, not for the money, but for the lying, you know where to find me. I'll be the guy in the expensive suit who's forgotten how to be happy without you. All my love, Elliot." P.S. The back porch step is still solid. I may be a terrible handyman, but I'm a stubborn one. June read the letter 3 times before the words finally sank in. The deed was real. She'd checked it twice. Her building, her diner, her dreams were safe. But more than that, the man who'd written these words wasn't the polished billionaire from the magazine covers. This was Eli, the man who'd struggled with simple repairs and blushed when she teased him, who'd listened to her fears and dreams as if they were precious gifts. He bought the building, she whispered to Danny, who'd been reading over her shoulder. Yeah, he did. He really loved me. Not June Carter, the successful diner owner. Not June Carter, the woman with property and security. He loved June Carter, the woman who was about to lose everything. Danny nodded. Seems like it. I told him to get out. The words came out as a sob. I told him to get out, and he left, and now he's gone back to his real life, and I. You're in love with him, Danny finished gently. I'm in love with a man who doesn't exist anymore. Or maybe, Danny said, closing the notebook and setting it beside the deed. You're in love with a man who finally figured out how to exist. The Seattle rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elliot's penthouse, but he barely noticed. He'd been back for 2 weeks, and the city felt like a foreign country. Too loud, too fast, too empty of everything that mattered. His assistant had scheduled back-to-back meetings to catch up on the business he'd abandoned, but Elliot found himself staring out at the skyline, thinking about a small diner where the coffee was always fresh and the owner had a laugh that could light up the darkest day. His phone buzzed with the 5th call from his publicist that morning. Sarah Morrison's story had broken 3 days ago, painting him as an eccentric billionaire who'd had a mental breakdown and disappeared into small-town America. The stock prices had recovered once news of his return spread, but the personal cost of his exposure felt immeasurable. He'd lost June. He'd lost the one person who'd ever loved him for who he was beneath all the money and power. And now he was back to being exactly what he'd tried to escape, a very wealthy, very successful, very lonely man. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Reed? Your 2 o'clock is here. Elliot didn't look up from the window. Cancel it, Patricia. Cancel everything for the rest of the day. Sir, it's the Henderson account. They flew in from New York specifically. I said cancel it. There was a pause, then Patricia's voice again, smaller now. Sir, there's also a delivery for you. The courier said it was urgent. Leave it on the desk. But instead of Patricia's footsteps retreating, he heard the door open and close, followed by different footsteps, lighter, more familiar. His heart stopped. You know, for a billionaire, you have terrible customer service. He spun around, and there she was. June Carter stood in the middle of his sterile, expensive office, looking completely out of place and absolutely perfect. She wore jeans and a simple green sweater, her hair pulled back in the messy bun he'd fallen in love with. In her hands, she held a thermos and a paper bag that smelled like heaven. June. Her name came out as a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make her disappear. I brought coffee, she said, setting the thermos on his desk. The good stuff. And some of Martha's apple pie, since I figured you probably haven't had a decent meal since you left. How are you here? Your assistant is very helpful when you mention that you're here about a personal matter involving her boss's mental health. June's smile was tentative, uncertain. I may have implied that you were pining away for lost love. I am, he said without thinking, then felt heat rise in his cheeks. I know what you mean. She moved closer, and he caught the scent of vanilla and coffee that always clung to her skin. I read your letter. About 50 times. June, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for lying to you, for not trusting you with the truth. Stop. She held up a hand. I didn't come here for an apology. I came here because I needed to see something. What? I needed to see if Eli Walsh was still in there somewhere, or if he'd disappeared when you put the expensive suit back on. Elliot looked down at his tailored charcoal suit, his Italian leather shoes, his platinum watch. I don't know if he is. I don't know how to be him in this world. That's funny, June said, reaching out to straighten his tie with the same casual intimacy she'd once used to hand him tools. Because I think Eli Walsh was just Elliot Reed without the fear. The fear. The fear that nobody could love you for who you really are. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. But I did love you, Elliot. I loved you when I thought you were broke and clumsy and had never owned a suit that cost more than $50. I loved you when you couldn't hammer a nail straight to save your life. I loved you when you sat on my porch drinking cheap beer and telling me about your dreams. Those weren't lies, he said quickly. My dreams, the way I felt about you, about the town, about the life we were building, none of that was a lie. I know, she smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over his frozen heart. That's why I'm here. But I'm not that man anymore. Look at this place, June. Look at this life. I have board meetings and corporate responsibilities and a world that expects me to be someone I'm not sure I want to be. So change it. The words were so simple, so June, that he almost laughed. Change it. I can't just walk away from billions of dollars and thousands of employees and who says you have to walk away? June moved to his desk and opened the paper bag, pulling out a slice of apple pie that made his mouth water. You know what I realized after you left? The diner ran just fine when you were there helping me. Better, actually, because I wasn't trying to do everything myself. She handed him a fork and took a bite of pie straight from the container. What if you didn't have to choose between being Elliot Reed and being Eli Walsh? What if you could be both? I don't understand. Run your company. Make your billions. But do it differently. Do it like someone who remembers what it feels like to worry about making rent, who knows that the best conversations happen over coffee that costs $2 instead of 20. She gestured around his sterile office. This isn't you, Elliot. The you I fell in love with wouldn't have an office that looks like a museum. He'd have pictures of people he cared about, maybe a plant that was dying because he forgot to water it, definitely a coffee mug with a chip in it, because it was his favorite. As she spoke, Elliot began to see it. Not just the office, but the life she was describing. A life where he could be successful and real, wealthy and humble, powerful and human. What about you? He asked quietly. What about the diner, and Danny, and your life in Millbrook? Well, June said, settling into the chair across from his desk as if she belonged there. That's the other thing I came to tell you. I've been thinking about that scholarship I gave up. The one to culinary school. June. Portland's only 3 hours from Seattle. I could study there, learn to be the chef I always dreamed of being. Maybe even open a second location someday, with a partner who knows a thing or two about business. Elliot's heart began to beat faster. A partner. Someone who's terrible at manual labor, but great at spreadsheets. Someone who makes me laugh even when he's driving me crazy. Someone who loves me enough to give up everything he thought he wanted, just to find out if I could love him back. She stood and walked around the desk, stopping directly in front of him. Someone who wrote me a letter that made me cry for 3 days straight, not because I was sad, but because I finally understood that the man I fell in love with was real all along. June, I love you, Elliot Reed. Not your money, not your company, not your fancy penthouse. I love the man who spent 3 months learning to fix my broken diner just so he could spend time with me. I love the man who listened to my dreams like they were the most important things in the world. I love the man who was brave enough to give up everything to find out if he was worth loving. She cupped his face in her hands, and her touch was everything he'd missed, everything he'd dreamed about during 2 weeks of sleepless nights. You are worth loving, she whispered. You always were. When he kissed her, it tasted like apple pie and coffee and the promise of a future he'd never dared to imagine. It tasted like home. Move in with me, he said against her lips. Not here, not in this sterile place. Let's find something real, something that feels like us. What about your company? Your responsibilities? I'll figure it out. We'll figure it out together. He pulled back to look at her, this woman who'd saved him from a life of beautiful emptiness. I spent my whole life building an empire because I thought it would make me worthy of love. But you taught me that I was already worthy. Now I want to build something different, something that matters. What did you have in mind? Elliot smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. How do you feel about a chain of diners that serves the best coffee this side of heaven and treats every customer like family? June laughed, the sound filling his office with warmth and life. I think that sounds like the perfect place for a clumsy handyman and a chef who's going back to school. Think Danny would be interested in a summer internship? I could use someone who actually knows how to fix things. I think Danny would love that. He's always wanted to see the city. As the Seattle rain continued to fall outside, Elliot Reed held June Carter in his arms and realized that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not someone who loved him for his money or his power or his potential, but someone who loved him for his heart. And for the first time since he'd left Millbrook, Elliot believed that maybe, just maybe, he was finally home. 6 months later, the first Reed and Carter Diner opened in Portland, Oregon. It served the best coffee in the Pacific Northwest, employed local teenagers at wages that let them save for college, and was run by a couple who proved every day that the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They can only be built, one honest moment at a time. And if you looked closely at the back booth, you might notice that one of the table legs was slightly crooked, held steady by a shim that had been hammered in place by someone who was still learning that some things are worth fixing, even if you're not very good at it yet. The important thing was that he kept trying. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.